everybody knows that the president has Claudine Gay been in effect forced out over allegations about plagiarism and over dissatisfaction with her dealing with the problem of anti-Semitism in the wake of the conflict in the Middle East that has broken out.
Yeah.
What do you make of what's going on over there?
Well, Claudine Gay is a symptom, not a cause, of what's going wrong in Harvard. And the situation in Harvard wouldn't be different if she'd had a different career, if she'd never been at Harvard, whatever. Glenn, the whole situation at Harvard and in academia in general, for me, is very painful to contemplate. Now, I arrived at Harvard as an undergraduate in 1965 and got my history degree, spent a couple of years fulfilling my obligation to the U.S. Army, among other things, returned as a grad student for 5 years, wrote my dissertation, and I was a faculty member for 4 years. And all of that is described in great detail in my autobiography, Life and History. And I love the place very much. It made me what I am. To be a faculty member, even for only 4 years, was a great privilege. Now, in the subsequent 40 plus years, Harvard and academia in general have moved away from their traditions. That's particularly true in the humanities, such as history and literature. And they have declined, Harvard and all the leading institutions, and declined very badly from an intellectual point of view. I think they've gone fundamentally off the track. And this is part of the reason they're in trouble now. You can see in many things Claudine Gay said as president, and in many things people constantly say at Harvard, that their view of their mission has changed completely. In my opinion, the traditional mission of a university is to pass on acquired knowledge and develop new knowledge and equip students with that knowledge. Now, students may want to use that knowledge to change the world in their subsequent careers, and that's great, and more power to them. But now we have a whole higher educational establishment that's convinced itself that its mission is to change the world, both within the institution and in other ways, and to teach a certain set of values that are going to help change the world. And when you adopt that position, you are inevitably corrupting your intellectual mission. You are ruling certain kinds of conclusions out of order, and you're robbing your students of their birthright, which is a genuine knowledge of their extraordinary past. Because instead, the main historical perspective that dominates today really holds that Western civilization before 1968 or so was distinguished mainly by its hopeless racism and sexism. And that therefore, it doesn't need to be taken seriously except as an example of what we shouldn't do. And that's why we're so busy appointing committees to make lists of the Harvard faculty members in the 17th and 18th centuries who owned slaves, a few slaves each, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, they did, okay? That was part of the culture, but that was not what made Harvard important then or at any time later. Yes, Harvard didn't have full equality for female students until the last few decades. No, they didn't treat women equally, but they were maintaining and expanding the intellectual history of the West, which is what universities are supposed to do. And again, they have lost track of that mission. And what has come out in the current crisis is that Harvard is really defined, I think now, by its relationship to our economic and political and social elite. It depends on the economic elite, financial elite, for money that it has to have every year. Its main social function, I'm sorry to say, is to supply the elite members of the financial community of all the professions. And it has adopted for itself the mission of deciding who among young people are going to be in that elite. And that's very far from the original educational mission or the mission which I discovered and was lucky enough to participate in for close to 15 years in the late 60s and 70s. And it's very sad. And I think because Harvard has so much money and all the elite institutions have so much money and they can live on their reputations, it's going to be very hard for the necessary reforms to take place there. They're much more likely to occur at smaller, lesser known institutions, or maybe even new institutions like the new University of Boston. At any rate, the current controversy is opening the door to a lot of what's going on. And a lot of people are paying attention. Fareed Zakaria, for instance, did a very fine 5-minute clip. Yes.
We have to understand the broad shift that has taken place at elite universities, which have gone from being centers of excellence to institutions pushing political agendas.
He was right. Everything he said was right. And I'm glad this audience got to see that. Yeah.
Well, it's a couple of things. One is about elitism. You say these are elite institutions and you indict them, and yet you indict them precisely for abandoning the standards of elite intellectual endeavor, it seems to me, that they ought to be adhering to. They ought to be willing to declare greatness of human achievement, even if it comes out of the West. They ought to be willing to pass on this heritage that that is our bequest of our forefathers, I almost said, God help me, who scaled heights and who opened vistas and who revolutionized ways of thinking and who posed profound questions. So that is the elitism that they ought to be adhering to. And yet there's a kind of luxury belief elitism, a kind of faddish, cliquish, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I sense a kind of social elitism, which the signature indicator of which is adherence to a kind of, I'm going to use the word woke, progressivism about social issues. And so they've lost their way. Harvard Corporation chose Claudine Gay as the candidate to replace Lawrence Bacow as president of the university. She had been dean of the faculty. You remember Henry Rosofsky, I'm sure.
Sure. Oh, sure.
An economic historian who was a grizzled, hardened, white male, technocrat kind of guy who, when I came to Harvard...
We might also add Jewish refugee from Poland.
Oh, let's not forget that.
And who escaped the Holocaust by the skin of his teeth. Yes, right. Yeah.
And who held sway over Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences for decades and had a tremendous impact on the intellectual character of the enterprise. And, what do I want to say here? I want to say Claudine Gay is no Henry Rosofsky. And in saying that, I cringe a little bit because it feels churlish somehow. I mean, it feels like a cheap shot. And yet it seems patently also to be the case. And I wonder how the corporation could have failed to notice that. Or are they not looking for Henry Rosofskys anymore?
They're not looking for Henry Rosofsky, but I want to go further back than that. The Harvard that I entered in 1965 had been created not by its current president, but by James Bryant Conant, who was one of the great educators of the 20th century. It had a general education program, courses in humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, which were simply distinguished by the quality of the people who taught them. Every freshman had to take one in each group. And Conant had hired people from other universities for the main reason that they would teach one of those courses.
You mean the Harvard faculty wasn't up to it?
He wanted the best people. He wanted David Reisman, for instance. That was one of those. Right. Now, nobody makes a hire like that anymore. Nobody hires anybody because of the teaching they're going to do, as I found out in my own career, that's for sure. And not only that, Glenn, Harvard, like any great institution at that point, and for decades later, was marketing a distinct educational experience, a distinct educational product. For instance, we had the fall term lasting until mid-December. It wasn't over in mid-December. We went home, we came back, we had 2 or 3 weeks of reading period. Reading period was when you caught up on all the reading you hadn't done. And take it from me, and all my classmates will tell you the same thing. You found out what you were made of intellectually and what you were capable of during reading period. I mean, I did, and a lot of other people did. And then you had exams and a short break. And then the spring term was the same. And that was a great system. Now, what happened, and this was around 20 years ago, the administration starts saying, our students don't like this. All their friends have their exams done by Christmas. They don't. With the implication that if we don't change this, not as many people will apply to Harvard, okay? To which I would have replied, so
Okay.
what? You're right. If they don't want it, fine. We're not going to have a shortage of people applying, sports fans. Let's be real here. Let's get the people who want what we have to offer. And I know this from friends of mine, the older faculty who had been Harvard undergraduates argued violently against this for the same reasons I am. And not only were they overruled, but they had it thrown in their faces. And faculty means, oh, you're just nostalgic. You just wanted to be the way you were. So reading period was done away with and no longer exists. And they're not offering a distinct intellectual product anymore. And I'm not aware of any Ivy League college that is, really. And the colleges that still are, like the University of Chicago and a few of the smaller ones. Actually, the most noteworthy ones are the St. John's colleges.
Yeah.
Very few were offering something distinct. And that's just tragic.
Yeah.
Yep.
Now, former President Claudine Gay was also accused of not handling well the disputes and disputation that broke out after the October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas on southern Israel, and the reactions and support of the Palestinians that erupted on college campuses, which sometimes bordered or crossed over into anti-Semitic expression, Jewish students feeling injured and unsafe and unwelcome, and so on. And that's kind of a piece of it, isn't it? I mean, that those two things go together in a way. The charges about plagiarism, which are a kind of feet of clay on the question of the intellectual heft of the president, but also her readiness to give voice to certain values in the context of a very difficult conflict in the Middle East. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the big problem is the feeling that university presidents have to take a stand on something like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In my opinion, that is not their job. Now, there's another dimension to this, namely that support for Palestine in opposition to Israel has been one of the knee-jerk reactions of the woke culture, which has a lot of adherents on campus. And that's just a fact. But I don't think that she should have made any statement about the rights and wrongs of any of it. Well, this is the thing, Glenn. In the same way that historians now feel their task is to tell us what should have been done in the past, not what was done, but what should have been, academics, instead of studying the way the world is, have sold themselves on the idea that their job is to tell us what it should be. And that's a much more dubious proposition, in my opinion.
But I want to say, I mean, you're at a congressional hearing. At least Stefanik, this arch-Trumpian,
Yep.
attack dog, comes at you. This is a moment of truth. You don't look at your notes. You don't recite a mantra. You spontaneously engage the moment. It's a question of, in effect, the quality of leadership and the quality of the person in that moment. And I don't think she measured up in that moment.